This is Western Civilization 1. I'm Dr. Young. We're going to continue our conversation today about the early Middle Ages. Now that we've covered the topic of Christianization, let's look at the political narrative here. The key kingdom that kind of dominates the politics of Western Europe in the early Middle Ages is the Frankish kingdom. And this is largely because of the Muslim invasions. There were two major kingdoms left over after the attempted reconquest of the Western Empire by Justinian in the 6th century. The Frankish kingdom and the Visigothic kingdom. The Frankish kingdom in northern Gaul and across what are now the Low Countries and into parts of Germany. And the Visigothic kingdom, which ruled over southern Gaul and most of Iberia. There were other kingdoms, in different places, but they were much smaller and less important than those two. And so, by the end of the 7th century, those are really kind of the dominant kingdoms in Western Europe. However, in the year 711, a Muslim force crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began to conquer into Spain, and ultimately succeeded in taking most of the Iberian Peninsula. There were some isolated enclaves up in the northern parts of Spain. In fact, the Basque peoples who traced their ancestry all the way back to the ancient world and are still kind of separatist, don't really consider themselves, at least not many of them, part of the nation of Spain, resisted this. They had also resisted Roman rule, and so there were Basques up there. There's also a kingdom called the Sueves. The kingdom of the Sueves, but these were kind of smaller and less important kingdoms. The Muslims took over most of Iberia, and this meant that the Frankish kingdom was the last remaining large Germanic kingdom of all of those that had established themselves in the Western Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries. And the Franks were also highly Romanized, as we've talked about. The ruling dynasty during this period was the Merovingian dynasty, from about 500 with Clovis, who we talked about, to the middle of the 8th century. The Merovingians ruled over that territory. However, the Merovingians were not the most stable of rulers, for a number of reasons. And here we have to get into the Germanic culture, specifically the Germanic political culture. For one, and this is the term that's on the slide here, the Franks exercised what they called the custom of partible inheritance. That is, that all of the surviving sons of a king, or a nobleman, or a prominent person, would receive a part of the inheritance. So every generation, a king would divide up all of his kingdom among all of his surviving sons. Now, the Franks were not the only ones to do this. The Ostrogoths had done this. Other Germanic peoples were accustomed to this. And the idea was that the way to choose the best king was effectively to let all of the possible claimants to the throne, that is, all of the sons of the previous king, fight it out among themselves for territory. This does not lend itself to good family relations necessarily, but if it works like that, if truly every generation the strongest one emerges from a battle, you can see that why that would work well. The last one standing is obviously the strongest, and the various nobles, other powerful individuals within the kingdom would kind of create alliances, line up behind who they thought was going to emerge at the top of the heap. The problem with this is that it's not always the case that a single individual emerges as the outright victor in a conflict like this. Because, often people die young of disease or of an accident or something like that, or they die in battle, and somebody who might have made a very good king ends up dying early, and none of the claimants to the throne are able to wrest a full advantage over the others, and so they each end up holding a part of the kingdom. And the other prominent individuals, for lack of a better word, let's use the word noble here, the other nobles in the kingdom would see opportunities, given the infighting within the royal family, to divide up some of the land and some of the power in the kingdom for themselves, right? To take advantage of these kings who were embroiled in conflicts with each other. Now, there were a few Merovingian kings who were able to establish their hegemony over the entire kingdom, but that ended up being the exception rather than the rule. Now, other things that created some instability in the kingdom were the fact that the Merovingians were itinerant kings. They did not stay in one place. They did not have any kind of capital. They really didn't have any real bureaucracy or anything like that, other than the retinue of nobles and knights, warriors who followed them around, and maintained their loyalty to the kings. But there were other nobles who had their own retinues, and so there emerged in the Merovingian kingdom certainly by the end of the 7th century, though the examples we're going to look at are in the 8th century, several powerful families, noble families, who wrested power away from the kings and even established themselves as people of high position in the Merovingian kingdom. The most prominent among them held the title of the mayors of the palace, and this one family, and what that meant effectively was that the mayors of the palace, that title meant like prime minister. It also meant supreme military commander. So the mayors of the palace were largely in control of the defense of the kingdom. They held much of the land of the kingdom in their own right. And the Merovingian kings became increasingly just titular figures, just kind of puppets who had the title of the king, but the mayors of the palace were the ones who held the most power in the kingdom. Now, we're going to look at a couple of these individuals. The first of note is a guy named Charles Martel. For some reason, I have a hard time saying that. It's almost a tongue twister for me. So if I say that strangely, please don't judge. All right. Charles Martel emerged as the mayor of the palace in the first half of the 8th century, and he gained greatest renown and greatest reputation for winning a battle in the year 732 against an advanced Muslim force that had crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and had begun to make their way across the kingdom of the Franks. This was really just a scout force sent by the now Muslim rulers of Spain to, figure out what was going on north of the Pyrenees, what was going on in the Frankish kingdom. Charles Martel took an army and headed them off and defeated them at the Battle of Poitiers, and sent them packing back across the Pyrenees. Interestingly, the Muslims never really tried a major full-scale invasion after that. Maybe they were scared of Charles Martel and his ability to lead armies. This is actually this victory involved an important innovation in military affairs. Charles Martel was the first to use in battle mounted shock cavalry. That is horsemen, warriors on horseback, whose primary purpose is to engage in very close combat with their enemies and to use shock weapons, that is things like pikes and spears and what we would call lances, to knock their opponents out of the saddle or off of the horse, or to charge into walls of infantrymen. Now, this was only possible because of a very small but very significant innovation that Charles Martel seems to have been one of the first to employ in Europe, and that invention is the stirrup. Stirrup, if you don't know, is the thing that you put your feet into when you're on horseback. It allows you to maintain stability on the horse, to use your feet to keep you in the saddle. It's really only with a stirrup that you can do shock sorts of warfare, because you run into somebody with a lance and you don't have your feet anchored in the stirrups, you're going to go right off the back of the horse. Cavalrymen had been used previous to this time, but mostly just to charge and not necessarily, and to scatter the enemies, and also to fire projectile weapons like arrows and things from horseback. But they they didn't arm the horses they didn't put armor on the horses or on themselves necessarily with this. This is the advent of heavy cavalry. And from this point on, due to that little innovation of the stirrup and Charles Martel's employment of that, this had a tremendous social impact, much like the hoplite phalanx or the advent of a navy had done in ancient Greece. The invention of the stirrup and the use of heavy shot cavalry in warfare in Western Europe created a situation where only those who could afford to outfit themselves and their horse with armor and with shock weapons did the fighting. That this became the major fighting force. The only ones wealthy enough to do that were nobles, and thus they came to constitute these mounted warriors, armored warriors, came to constitute the nobility of Europe. And that takes some time to develop. That's not put into place immediately, but the social change begins in the early 8th century with Charles Martel and the Battle of Poitiers. Okay, so remember that term. You may see this on an exam. Now, Charles Martel never attempted himself to become king, to supplant the Merovingian king, but his son Pepin, known as Pepin the Short, for the simple reason that he was not very tall, he got the short genes in the family. His son Charles was probably over 6 feet tall, so it's not exactly sure why Pepin was short, but anyway, the epithet is there. Pepin the Short, despite his unfortunate name, was the first of this family to become the kings of the Frankish kingdom, supplanting the Merovingians. This dynasty is known as the Carolingian dynasty because most of the prominent members of the dynasty were named Charles. The name Charles in Latin is Carolus, hence Carolingian. And so, anyway, that's the change in dynasty. There's a document from the 8th century that gives us an indication of how this happened. As it turns out, Pepin was a very close ally of the Pope, and this is an important moment in Western Europe, because the Pope, up to this point, had still been kind of the client of the emperor in the Byzantine Empire. Italy had been retaken by Justinian, as we've talked about, and the Pope was reliant for protection and other things on the Byzantine emperors. But the Byzantine Empire had fallen onto hard times in this period. They were often being attacked by Muslims. In the 8th century, a Muslim navy even sailed into the Dardanelles Strait and right up to the harbor of Constantinople and attacked the city directly. It was only through the use of another important military innovation called Greek fire, which is an explosive that could be fired from a catapult. And when it hits particularly water, it burns. It's made partly of phosphorus, and so the Byzantines used Greek fire to repel the Muslim attack on the city. But they were occupied with all sorts of things. There were intrigues politically in Constantinople, and so the emperors were really in no position to act as a patron for the popes. The popes thus turned to the Frankish kings. Okay. And in this case, the Frankish kings were really in no position to help them either, because the majority of the power in the Frankish kingdom was held by the mayors of the palace. And so Pepin, in the 740s, went at the head of an army down to Italy. The Pope, Rome had been besieged by another Germanic group called the Lombards, and Pepin relieved the city of Rome, and the Pope thus owed him a big one, right? He did him a solid, and so the Pope owed him a favor. And so we pick up from the Annals of Lorsch here. In the year 749, as it says, Pepin sent a couple of clergymen who were close allies of his. Burchard, the Bishop of Würzburg, this is spelled wrong. Sorry for the typo there. And Fulrad, who was a priest, were sent by Pepin to Pope Zacharias to ask his advice in regard to the kings who were then ruling in France, and that's not France, it should be Francia, or the Frankish kingdom, who had the title of king but no real royal authority. And so the question that Pepin sent these messengers to ask the Pope was, who should be king? Should it be the guy who has the title of king but no real power,
or should it be the guy who holds the authority but doesn't have the title of king yet? And the Pope, knowing where his keys were cut, so to speak, knowing that Pepin had bailed him out and could potentially do that again, sent him a message, as it says, that it would be better that he who actually had the power should be called king. And so with the sanction of the Pope, Pepin then decided to depose the reigning Frankish king, whose name was Childeric. Childeric, as it says here, who had the name of king, was shorn of his locks and sent into a monastery. The Merovingian kings, the mark of their kingship was that they never cut their hair. This actually, the inspiration for that was the story of Samson from the Bible, with whom they identified a great deal. And so, as a kind of insult and to show that he had been stripped of his power, Pepin ordered that Childeric's hair be shaved and that he be sent into a monastery to become a monk. And Pepin then was crowned as king and ruled thenceforth as the beginning of the Carolingian dynasty. Right. Now, this relationship, as we see in the last couple of entries here, between the Pope and Pope Stephen and Pepin, remained close. And in fact, as an interesting strike against the Byzantines, who still claimed Italy as a province, Pepin decreed that all of central Italy, running from Rome in the west, across the Apennine Mountains up to Ravenna, which was the provincial capital of Byzantine Italy, would thenceforth be the property of the Pope. And this piece of land was known in the Middle Ages as the Patrimonia Sancti Petri. That's the Latin term. The English would be the patrimony of St. Peter, or for short, the Papal States. The Pope was the territorial lord over all of central Italy all through the Middle Ages, ruled that outright, though there was interference, of course, as we'll see, there's going to be conflict between popes and kings later on. Some of that is still in place today. The Vatican City is still an independent nation. It is not part of Italy. It is its own country. It's only a few city blocks, but it is the last remnant of that patrimony of St. Peter that was created in the 8th century by Pepin and by Pope Stephen. Okay, back to Pepin here, or rather to his son. Pepin's son, who inherited the throne, and it's actually complicated, he had two adult sons. The older one, Charlemagne, was not the most capable of individuals. He was named co-king, but he died only 3 years into this co-rule, and the one who ended up ruling the kingdom for over 40 years was Pepin's younger son, Charles. His given name was Charles. He is also called Charles the Great. And if you put that into Latin, it becomes Carolus Magnus, Magnus meaning great, and that becomes shortened to Charlemagne. Charlemagne was easily the most important king of the early Middle Ages in Western Europe. He is one of the truly towering figures in all of the story of Western civilization. We have offered entire semester courses at Flagler College on Charlemagne. He's tremendously important. I'm going to try to characterize his rule, his accomplishments, in just a few minutes here by breaking it down to a few key points. First of all, Charlemagne spent much of his rule from 768 to 814, so more than 45 years, spent most of his very long rule in the saddle fighting wars against rivals. These were wars not only of conquest, but also of Christianization. Charlemagne was a great sponsor of the church, a close ally not only of the Pope, but also a lot of monks and missionaries and others who were actively involved in the evangelization and Christianization of Europe. And there were neighbors of the Frankish kingdom who had still not converted to Christianity, most prominently the Saxon people to the northeast of Charlemagne's Frankish kingdom. And Charlemagne spent a good deal of time fighting in those territories. Okay, so if we look at a map of his empire here, and this is taken out of a book, so it's not the clearest thing in the world, but you can see that initially his kingdom extended pretty much down to the Mediterranean. The Merovingian kings were highly Romanized and still had a good deal of contact with what was going on in the Mediterranean, and all the way up here to the Rhine River, and even across the Rhine River a bit. But this area up here called Saxony, and was ruled by a group of people called the Saxons. This area here of northern Italy called Lombardy was ruled by the Lombards. And of course, Spain was controlled by Muslims. Charlemagne waged major campaigns into Saxony, down here into Lombardy, and down here into Spain. He also ended up establishing a kind of tributary hegemony over the lands all the way across the Elbe River over to the Oder River here, which is now on the border between Germany and Poland, as well as down here into this region that was called Pannonia, what is now Austria and part of Hungary. Okay. And so Charlemagne's lands were extensive, and much of this was accomplished through conquest. As he conquered, he brought in missionaries and monks, built monasteries and churches, and forced the people he had conquered to listen to their message. One could say very easily, accurately I should say, that Charlemagne accomplished Christianization by the sword. The Saxons gave in, ultimately having been defeated by Charlemagne and converted to Christianity, same with many of the Lombards. And so Charlemagne was one of the central catalysts in the initial conversion of Europe and in the beginning of the process of Christianization. And Charlemagne doesn't seem to have seen any conflict in spreading Christianity by the sword. He was, after all, a warrior king. Now, once he had conquered all of this territory, Charlemagne set up an effective system of governance and a bureaucracy. Key to this were administrative units, and we can't see them here on the map, but these key administrative units called counties. Each one presided over by a count, hence the Latin word is comes, hence the origin of the term count. It actually was an earlier Roman title, but Charlemagne employed it to mean what it came to mean in the Middle Ages, meaning sort of high, noble, provincial governor, as it were. All right. And each of the counts was chosen carefully by Charlemagne from among his nobles. They were often chosen from one place and sent to another place to rule as count, so they didn't have close local ties and could not create a system of kind of independence or autonomy in the region they ruled. And so Charlemagne, the system of counts was key to his ability to govern his empire. Beyond that, he had another layer of bureaucracy that was even more important, called the missi dominici. You can see the term down here. The Latin means the Lord's messengers, or messengers of the Lord. The Lord in this case meaning Charlemagne, not God. And the purpose of the missi dominici was really to spy on the counts and on other local officials to make sure they were doing the right thing. In a declaration called, the technical term for it in the Carolingian world was a capitulary. In this capitulary from the year 802, Charlemagne says, the most serene and most Christian Lord Emperor Charles has chosen from his nobles the wisest and most prudent men, both archbishops and some of the other bishops also, and venerable abbots and pious laymen, and has sent them throughout his whole kingdom, and through them by all the following chapters, that is, by the stuff that comes after this in the document, has allowed men to live in accordance with the correct law. Moreover, where anything which is not right and just has been enacted in the law, he has ordered them to inquire into this most diligently, and to inform him of it. He desires God granting to reform it. So what that means, in short, is that he sent these people out to spy on others and report back to him if they were doing anything untoward, if they were doing anything that went against the laws that he had decreed. Notice here the standard by which he chooses the people to serve in this key position in his bureaucracy. Most of them are chosen from clergymen, from the church, right? From archbishops and other bishops and abbots. That is, abbots meaning the head of monasteries. Some were laymen, that is, non-clergymen. Really, what it came down to was he chose the most prudent men and the wisest men. So there was some element of meritocracy here, He just happened to find most of the wisest and most prudent men in the church, because the church was the major institution that provided education, and he needed educated men to fulfill these important responsibilities, right? So there's a very close alliance between Charlemagne and the church. In fact, he was, make no mistake about it, the head of the church in his kingdom. He sort of did administratively, bureaucratically, whatever he wanted with the church. Now, the term Renaissance has been applied to the era of Charlemagne largely to capture the fact that Charlemagne was a great sponsor of education, a great sponsor of scholarly activity. He set up several schools in his kingdom. The most important of these was in his favorite city, a kind of capital city, the city of Aachen, up here in what is now far northwestern Germany, kind of right on the border with the Low Countries there. The city of Aachen was his kind of northern capital, and he recruited from all over the place, even outside his kingdom, for the best scholars to come to Aachen and to take up the positions of teachers in this palace school. And the main responsibility of the palace school was to train government bureaucrats, to train up the next generation of counts and missi dominici and leaders in the church, the next generation of bishops and archbishops and abbots. The head of the palace school was chosen from, recruited from all the way up here in Northumberland or Northumbria, northern England. His name was Alcuin. He was from York, so Alcuin of York became the head of the palace school. There were also people recruited from down here in Spain and Italy and other places to come to Aachen. And there was a good deal of scholarly activity there. Not a lot of original work necessarily, but definitely the producing of new editions of classical texts, and thus the preservation of the Greco-Roman tradition. And so this flourishing has been labeled Renaissance. I personally think this is an overused term. We had the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries in Italy, and scholars of the Middle Ages said, well, no, there was also a Renaissance in the 12th century. And then, these early medievalists said, well, there's also a Renaissance in the Carolingian period, and pretty soon the term Renaissance loses a lot of its meaning. But that doesn't necessarily denigrate or discount the great scholarly activities that were accomplished by these scholars operating under the sponsorship and the auspices of Charlemagne and later his son Louis, which was pretty important and pretty profound. Now, last point here. Charlemagne, in the year 800, on Christmas Day, was crowned emperor by the Pope. He had gone to Rome. There was a new uprising of the Lombards, who had been mostly conquered by Charlemagne, but there were a few groups who were still operating, kind of marauding autonomously. They had attacked Rome again, and so Charlemagne went to the defense of the Pope, and he stayed on after defeating the Lombards in Rome for the Christmas holiday. And in the church on Christmas Day, the Pope crowned him emperor. Now, one of the sources that you're assigned to read for this week is, of course, the two lives of Charlemagne, and I'll get into those a little bit more in a few minutes here. But Einhard, who was the earlier of the two authors that we were assigned to read, noted this, and if you're following along in the Penguin edition, which is the assigned text for the course, this is on page 38, okay, Einhard writes, "Thus Charles traveled to Rome to restore the state of the church, which was extremely disturbed, and he spent the whole winter there. It was at this time that he received the title of Emperor and Augustus. At first he disliked this so much that he said that he would not have entered the church that day, even though it was a great feast day, if he had known in advance of the Pope's plan." Now, this is a puzzle. Why would Charlemagne object to being crowned emperor? And this could form some of the subject of your primary source exploration on the two lives of Charlemagne, which gives you two options, one of which is to kind of examine the motivations of Charlemagne himself. The other one is to compare and contrast the motivations of the two authors of these lives, Einhard and Notker, who I'll have something more to say about again in a few minutes here. Right? Why would Charlemagne object to being crowned emperor? Well, if you read on, you'll see that one of the reasons is that he knew that this would anger the other individual who held the title of emperor, that is, the emperor in Constantinople, right? Einhard continues by saying he bore the animosity that the assumption of this title caused with great patience, for the Roman emperors, and it's plural there because there were several emperors who ruled in Constantinople during Charlemagne's reign. He lived a lot longer than any of them. For the emperors were angry about it. He overcame their opposition through his greatness of spirit, which was without doubt far greater than theirs, by often sending ambassadors to them and by calling them his brothers in his letters. Right. So he was worried about this political alliance with the Byzantine Empire, which he had cultivated very carefully. But there may be other reasons for it, right? Charlemagne was a Frank. Even though he was a Romanized Frank, he still identified himself very much as a Frank. He was known, his title up to that point was Rex Francorum, or the King of the Franks. By the way, that's not the King of Francia or the King of France, it's the King of the Franks. This is how these early medieval kings identified themselves, by their people rather than by a specific piece of land. And that's a very Germanic way of thinking. To call him the Emperor of Rome, on the other hand, was really kind of a foreign concept to him. Now, make no mistake, I don't think Charlemagne was surprised by this. I think he probably planned it, in fact, but Einhard had to, he probably tried to make it look like he really didn't want the position of emperor. He embraced it quite well after this and used it, as we saw in the document about the Missi Dominici. He's already, by 802, only a couple of years later, using the title emperor here in this document, right? So it didn't take him too long to become accustomed to that. But, one has to read between the lines here and see the political machinations at work, the kinds of issues that Charlemagne had to face as he, moved his way forward in ruling his kingdom. And one of those was, the potential problems of the assumption of emperor, both with the Byzantine emperors and potentially with his people, who might think that he is putting on airs that are a little too big for him, right? Calling himself the Emperor of Rome rather than being happy with the title King of the Franks. So Charlemagne had to negotiate all of those things. In fact, one of the ways to approach the question of what are the motivations of Charlemagne is to think of the major cultural strands that are coming together in the early Middle Ages. Charlemagne was Romanized, and he had in some ways to present himself as a Roman, but he was also a Frank and had to hold on to that cultural legacy. He was also a very committed Christian, definitely in his public persona, if not in his own personal kind of behavior. He seems to have, had his own vices that he enjoyed, for sure. Okay, but in any case, Charlemagne is trying to balance all of these competing interests in his kingdom: his Roman persona with his Frankish persona, with his Christian persona. All of them are important to him, but, to some extent they exist in tension with each other, right? So, Einhard talks about him preferring to dress in the Frankish manner and teaching his children to ride horses and fight and hunt and things like this, because that's what good Franks did. But on the other hand, he also educated himself and others in the Greco-Roman liberal arts tradition, right? So he had to try to accomplish both of those things because they were both important to him. Okay, so that's kind of a major point to consider as you plot out how you're going to approach the prompt to this question of this paper this week. Now, there are several other things that we can say about Charlemagne. If you have questions about him, please address them to the discussion boards. Be happy to elaborate and talk more about Charlemagne. In any case, it should be said that his kingdom did not long outlive him. He had the good fortune of having only one surviving adult son. His name was Louis. By the way, the Carolingian Franks tended to name all of their children every generation with the same 3 or 4 names. You can see that Charles was popular, Pepin was popular, Louis is one of the other really popular names, and the other one is Lothar. This is not so complicated yet, but once we get into the later Carolingian periods, there are going to be lots of Charleses and lots of Louis and lots of Lothars and lots of Pepins, and it becomes kind of confusing to keep track of all of them. In any case, Charlemagne's son was named Louis, and he became the king in 814 when his father died. He was known as Louis the Pious rather than Louis the Great because he wasn't as great as his father. He was much less capable. He was a capable king. The great mark of his rule was how religious he was. He seems to have not shared his father's vices. He was a devoutly religious man. Kind of did away with all of the drinking and partying and wenching and things like that went on in his father's court, and established this very holy kind of order at the head of the kingdom. With Louis, the luck of the Carolingians ran out. For every generation, for several at this point, the Carolingians had one clear heir to the family's inheritance. But Louis ended up with 3 adult sons. And toward the end of his nearly 30-year reign, he ruled for 26 years, from 814 to 840. His 3 sons ended up in conflict with themselves and with him. Louis attempted to make his oldest son Lothar the only heir to the throne. The younger sons, Charles and Louis, again, not the most original names, were not happy with this, of course, and ended up fighting against their father and their brother. Once Louis died, that fight continued, and finally, in the year 843, the 3 brothers reached a settlement where they agreed to stop fighting and signed a treaty with each other. This is known as the Treaty of Verdun, the city in northern France where this was brought about. And so here is the map that resulted from that. Okay, I will, by the way, return to the previous slide and talk about Einhard and Nocher in a moment here. These are out of order. Lothar, being the oldest, got first dibs, and he said, well, I want Aachen, I want the northern capital, and I also want access to Rome, and so give me this middle swath here, right? Charles, known as Charles the Bald, for obvious reasons, took the western part of the empire here, and the younger son Louis, known as Louis the German, ended up taking the eastern part here. Now, I might ask, who was the least wise of the 3? And the obvious answer is, of course, that the oldest son, Lothar, was not very wise here, because he effectively surrounded his kingdom with the kingdoms of his brothers. There are not necessarily any good natural boundaries running, on the borders of his kingdom. In fact, there are very, large natural boundaries that run right through the middle of his kingdom and thus cut off the northern part from the southern part. That would be the Alps mountains here. And so Lothar was not so wise, and only a generation or so later, this middle kingdom was swallowed up in fighting by the eastern and western kingdoms. They kind of divided and conquered it, so to speak, right? Now, after that, the Carolingians really ran out of luck, and each of these kings ended up with several sons and ended up following custom and dividing up the kingdom again between all of their surviving sons. And sometimes there were relatively powerful individuals who ended up carving out a hegemony for themselves, but none of these reigns were terribly long. And ultimately, all of these kingdoms end up getting divided up into smaller and smaller entities and becoming less and less stable, more given to constant conflict with all of the other rival kingdoms. That's one of the things that leads to the breakup of the Carolingian Empire. There were other factors that exacerbated this decline, specifically invasion from multiple quarters. The Muslims were increasingly emboldened down here in the Mediterranean, to the point that they took not only these islands out here, these are the Balearic Islands, but also Sardinia and Corsica, and even established a permanent presence down here. They came to rule Sicily, which is just off the map, and had a permanent presence down here in southern Italy, and even had outposts up here in southern France, right? And so the Muslims helped to destabilize the southern border of the kingdom. Over here to the east, there was a renewed invasion of Central Asian horsemen, the same territory that had produced the Huns in a few centuries earlier than this. There was a new group who broke out of Central Asia, came over here into the eastern part of the kingdom, over here into what is now Hungary and Austria, and attacked these territories and thus destabilized the whole eastern part of the kingdom. This group was known as the Magyars, and they ended up settling in large numbers in what is now Hungary, here right on the Danube River. Hungary, by the way, the word for Hungarian in Hungarian is Magyar, and so this language dates, sort of traces its origins back to these Magyar people who broke out of Central Asia in the 9th century. Most famously, there were groups of invaders from up here in Scandinavia, from Denmark and Sweden and Norway, or what are now those countries, and these go under the label Vikings. Now, there are several things that we need to say about the Vikings, but I want to pause it at that point and just, comment on the instability that by the latter part of the 9th century was the rule of the day in the Carolingian world. This place was a mess, both because of infighting between the different kings and different nobles, now that the kingdoms were being divided up over and over again, and because of these invasions from the south, from the east, and from the north. The Carolingian Empire became tremendously unstable. And it's with that we should talk about these two authors of the lives of Charlemagne, because you may choose to answer the prompt. You can only do one of the two, by the way. You may choose to answer the prompt of the compare and contrast the motivations of the two authors of these texts, right? And so let me say a few things about Einhard and Notker, okay? Einhard, first of all, you can notice his dates, all right? He was born just a few years after Charlemagne became king, and died around the same time as Louis the Pious. And so his life corresponded with the reigns of Charlemagne and Louis. This was, of course, the height of the Carolingian Empire. These are the points of greatest success and greatest extent. Einhard, early in his life, showed promise as a scholar, and so he was given a spot in the palace school in Aachen, a student under Alcuin of York, and developed great proficiency as a writer. He did not hold a specific title under Charlemagne, but he later became the private secretary to Louis the Pious. So very close to the family. And you can see this come out in his narrative. He says at the beginning, for instance, and I'm not going to read it directly, I'll just paraphrase it, I felt like I was the one best equipped to write the life of Charlemagne because he was like a father to me. I was personally acquainted with him. I lived in his house. I knew him extremely well, and if I'm not going to write this, then I'm not sure who will, right? So his personal acquaintance is one of the key factors in this, but there are some others that we might note, okay? First is the question of genre, all right? Now, if you don't know what the word genre means, it means like type of literature, right? There are modern genres like the novel or the biography or something like that, and we could break those down, into genres like science fiction and romance and fantasy and historical fiction and things like this. All right, so those are modern genres. Those genres are relatively recent developments. There were different genres of literature in the Middle Ages that have fallen out of use for the most part. One of the key genres in this period was the genre of vita. That's the Latin word. It means life. Many texts were written in this period about holy individuals, about people who had distinguished themselves for their great deeds in the service of God. Vitae, that's the plural, were written largely to make a case that one or another individual ought to be considered a saint. And one of the key requirements for becoming a saint, of course, was to perform miracles or have miracles associated with one's deeds. And you can see this pattern in the Vita Caroli, the life of Charles, that Einhard writes. Okay, Vitae tended to focus on personal characteristics, especially piety. Einhard uses that genre, uses the conventions of that genre, and you can see all throughout his text, his writings about the personal character of Charlemagne. He talks a lot about his relationship with his children, his family. He talks about his kind of physical characteristics and also his the virtues that showed forth in Charlemagne, and all of that is in keeping with the genre of Vita. There are even some hints that this person, Charlemagne, was highly favored by God. Toward the end of the work, for instance, he comments on a number of miraculous events that took place as portents of the impending death of Charlemagne. Sometimes these are catastrophes. So there were eclipses of the sun and moon, he says. The bridge over the Rhine River that he had built suddenly burned down mysteriously. There were a couple of other misfortunes, and all of this seemed to indicate that God was signaling the ultimate demise, the death of this great Christian ruler, and was mourning it, so to speak, right? Well, all of that, again, is in keeping with the genre of Vita. Einhard wrote in a period when the kingdom was tremendously stable. It was doing very well. Contrast that then with Notker, who, as you can see, was born around the time Einhard died, wrote his account of the life of Charlemagne in the 880s, several decades after the reign of Louis the Pious, and moreover, right in the middle of the period when the kingdom was really starting to fall apart, when these multiple Carolingian rulers were fighting with each other, where Vikings were invading, where Muslims were invading from the south and Magyars from the east. Notker wrote specifically for a Carolingian ruler whose name was Charles the Fat. I'm not sure they called him that to his face or during his life, but that was the epithet by which he was known. One can get a hint that many of these later Carolingian rulers were not terribly popular because of the names they're given, right? Charles the Fat, not the most flattering title. There's also a Louis the Child, for instance, and I believe there's even a Charles the Simple at some point. Could be translated probably as Charles the Stupid. These later Carolingians don't exactly impress the people who were writing about them. Charles the Fat visited St. Gall, which was one of the most important monasteries. That's where Notker spent most of his life as a monk. And Charles had visited that when Notker was a relatively young man. He was only there for 3 days, but Notker may have met him. In any case, he sort of established this contact with him, and he wrote this life of Charlemagne, this account of Charlemagne's life, for Charles the Fat. Why, you might ask? Well, as you can see through several hints in the text, he says over and over again, your great-grandfather was a tremendously good ruler for these reasons. And it's sort of like, hint, hint, you really need to be more like him. This text is didactic. It's meant to educate Charles on how to be a good ruler, because Notker knew that the Carolingian kingdom really needed somebody to follow the example of Charlemagne to get themselves out of the mess they were in, politically and economically. Right? This text was not written in the genre of Vita. Rather, it was written in a different medieval genre, which is known as Gesta. Gesta could be translated as deeds. This is just and these are anecdotal accounts rather than a kind of birth to death thing that you might find in a chronicle or an annal. Gestae were written to just recount anecdotes, right? And this whole text of Notker's is anecdotal. There are two specific types of anecdote. In the first part, he talks about Charlemagne's care of the church, and specifically how he rooted out corruption in the church, how he gave favor to people who were truly pious, and less favor to people who were hypocritical, right? Notker seems to be identifying thus the corruption in the church that existed in his day, and worrying about it, and saying to Charles the Fat, you need to interact with the church like Charlemagne interacted with the church. In the second part of the work, we have all kinds of anecdotes about Charlemagne as military leader, about how he conquered all of these lands, how he's a great defender of Christianity, how he overcame in battle, and things like this. And there are even sort of references, sometimes overt, sometimes more subtle, to the invasions coming from the Vikings and others. Notker seems to be, again, prodding Charles to say, you need to be more like Charlemagne to fight off all these invaders and to overcome these people who are guilty of corruption and breaking up the kingdom like this, right? So this text is didactic. Interestingly, it was not completed. Charles was deposed and killed in the year 887, and Notker seems to have stopped writing the text at that point. It's like, if the guy I'm writing for is dead, why bother to continue? And so it's not a complete text, but it does give some wonderful anecdotes about Charlemagne. Now, in terms of accuracy, Einhard's is obviously much more accurate, but this isn't just a question of accuracy. If you're responding to that second prompt, maybe it's the first prompt, I can't remember which order they're in. If you're responding to the prompt that asks you to compare and contrast, the question of accuracy really isn't an important question. You're dealing with the motives and the contexts of these two writers, which differ tremendously from each other, right? Einhard, again, writing in a day when the kingdom was still stable, when the fruits of what Charlemagne had accomplished were still very apparent. Notker writing in a day when those sorts of things are distant in the mind, and Charlemagne has become more the figure of legend than anything. And so his accounts are, drawn second and third hand. Notker almost certainly borrowed from Einhard's text and probably anticipated that the audience who would read his account had already read Einhard. And so, it's just totally different circumstances. And that's the kind of thing you need to account for as you write this paper. All right. If you have questions, again, please address them to the discussion board, or feel free to email me if you like. All right. Let's talk about Vikings for the last few minutes of this video. The Vikings, this name, first of all, this title, requires some explanation. This is not an ethnic term necessarily. Okay, the people from Scandinavia were known by others as the Norse or the Northmen, or just Normans. They came from Scandinavia. Like other Germanic peoples, they were agriculturalists. They farmed. But that far north, the growing season tends to be short. The produce that one is able to eke out from the soil is often not so plentiful. And so these Scandinavians tended to, they organized their society according to kind of military lines. The war leaders were the dominant figures. This doesn't mean that they were primitive or simple in their organization. In fact, the Norse ended up producing what is, I think, correctly labeled the world's first parliament structure. They had this organization that met periodically called the Thing. I'm not making that up. They called it the Thing, or alternately the All Thing. And this met a few times a year, or maybe just once a year, depended on the circumstances, where all of the prominent leaders would come together and talk about the problems they were having, the crises they were facing, and come up with solutions to them, right? So the Thing was like a parliament of all of the prominent individuals in Scandinavia. Now, these war leaders would often gather together young men who wanted to go, who were adventurous, and in order to supplement their livelihood, they would take these ships called longboats. One is pictured here, a reconstructed one in a museum. And the thing about the longboat is that it is a capable ocean-going vessel. Around the year 1100, a group of Norse, led by a guy named Leif Erikson, ended up making it all the way to what is now Newfoundland in Canada. And of course, the Norse settled in Iceland and in Greenland, and they must have been pretty hardy to eke out an existence from Greenland, right? So it's a capable ocean-going vessel, but as you can see, it draws very little water. It sits very shallow in the water. It's easy to row and to maneuver, and thus the ship could cross oceans but also go up rivers, which meant the Vikings could get just about anywhere they wanted to go. Now, in order to supplement their livelihood, they would thus cross the North Sea or cross the Baltic and attack either the British Isles or the European continent. And these sorts of activities began in the 8th century in England and precipitated into the 9th and 10th centuries in other places. So this is a map that gives us an indication of everywhere the Vikings went. Because one of the things to note about them is that, this initial phase, they would go and raid into these territories. They would sail up the rivers. They tended to hit institutions that were wealthy but had little by way of defense, especially monasteries and churches. These Vikings were not converted to Christianity at this point necessarily, and so they didn't hold any fear or have any respect for the religious institutions. So they hit these places, but pretty soon the Vikings began to notice that the weather was better in the continent, that the growing season was longer, that they probably could do better for themselves if they went there, and Scandinavia seems to have been quite overpopulated at this point. So there were groups who ended up settling in these places. In England, for instance, by the end of the 9th century, the Scandinavians had taken over most of England. You can see here I guess about half of it. All of this land in red here became part of a kingdom known as the Danelaw, which ruled for much of the 10th century into the 11th century. The only surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdom at this point was the kingdom of Wessex down here in the south, this part in yellow here, right? They also settled in, after raiding into Francia, they ended up settling here in Normandy. A Viking leader named Rollo, really great name, one of the great names of history, extracted from a Carolingian king there the title of Duke of Normandy, and set himself up as the ruler of northern France. A century and a half after Rollo, one of his descendants, whose name was William, also the Duke of Normandy, ended up crossing the English Channel with an army and conquering England, right? And so that's why this says 11th century they went there, because these are the descendants of the Vikings who established themselves over here in Normandy, right? So these people are called the Normans. William, known as William the Conqueror, set up the Norman dynasty in England, and I'll have more to say about that later. But the Vikings went a lot of other places too. They sailed across the Baltic here over into Eastern Europe and ended up setting up a series of political hegemonies in this region. And these Vikings were known as the Rus. This is the origin of the term Russian. The leaders of that community, trace their ancestry back to these Vikings who settled in the 10th century in Eastern Europe, especially the most prominent settlement of the Rus Vikings was the city of Kiev, what is now the capital of the Ukraine. And from there, they ended up all the way down here in the Black Sea, even established settlements, in territories very close to Constantinople. The Vikings tended to hire themselves out as mercenaries to the Byzantine emperors, and so they had a long-standing presence over here in Eastern Europe. They sailed down the Atlantic coast of Western Europe as well, and set up kind of permanent residences. Well, not really permanent residences, but they attacked all along the coastlands here, sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar. There's a story about a monastery that was on the Loire River up here in western France that got hit by Viking invasion several times, and so they packed up everything they had and moved down here to southern France along the Rhone River. And about a generation later, Vikings, came through the Strait of Gibraltar, sailed up the Rhone River, and hit the same poor monastery. But one group of these Normans ended up defeating the Muslims and taking control of Sicily and southern Italy and setting up a very powerful kingdom here known as the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, right? And so the Vikings were among the most prolific peoples in terms of settlement, colonization, conquest in all of European history. Unfortunately, they're most known for these kind of stereotypes we have of Vikings of just being these bloodthirsty warriors who wear helmets that have horns on them. To my knowledge, no Viking ever wore a horned helmet. That would not exactly be practical. Too many problems created with that. But these sort of romantic, fictionalized notions we have of Vikings come largely from comic strips like Hagar the Horrible, from the recent Capital One credit card commercials, from the Minnesota Vikings football team, from lots of other sources that have little to do with their historical importance. So hopefully I've given you a sense of how important these Norsemen are. In the next lecture, we will sort of move on from this. The 9th and 10th centuries are pretty chaotic in Europe, a lot of changes taking place, a lot of tension, a lot of warfare. Things begin to settle down around the turn of the first millennium, and thus we enter into a period of great vitality and great creativity, the period when the kind of old Europe was created, as it were. So you can look forward to that. Thanks.